Hi everyone, I'm Meteorologist Royal Norman. This is Sonoran Sky Live, a service of First Alert and Arizona's family. We have a great topic to talk about and a great person to talk about it today, David Saylor, who is the director of ASU School of Geophysical Sciences and Urban Planning. David, how are you today?
I'm fine. Let me just correct you. Geographical sciences.
Geographical, I know. You know what? Here's the deal. I should have put my glasses on to read your title, but I didn't. Shame on me.
No worries.
David, we're going to talk about data centers and the heat that they put out. Data centers are big in the news right now, but we really want to focus on the heat aspect. There's all kinds of aspects of data centers, but you and your colleagues recently published a study that is getting a lot of traction around the country and around the world about some actual statistics on how these data centers may heat up neighborhoods. Are you surprised at the response that you've gotten so far?
Not really. I knew
Okay.
it was a bit of a controversial topic when we went into it. So I was not surprised that we had all sorts of people, coming out wanting to hear more about our study, ranging from news media to public advocacy groups.
And so how do you go about deciding, well, first of all, deciding to do a study is probably easier than actually figuring out what you need to do and how many people you need to do it. What kind of it seems to me like, for instance, here in the TV world, we get these surveys every day where, StubHub says this is the best place to live, or get whatever website says, but they've just done a little thing on their computer and a little survey and boom, this is the place. This is a study. This took people power, did it not?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
So how do you go about planning that?
So we didn't actually plan it from the get-go. Really, this was an evolution of a research project that we've had funded here at ASU for the past 4 years, where we've been looking at extreme heat across Phoenix and across Tucson as well, and trying to understand the drivers of extreme heat and the spatial variability and temporal variability, but also looking at solutions. And so as we were making measurements in all sorts of different neighborhoods around green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, and the cool paving projects across Phoenix, it became apparent that really the elephant in the room in terms of heat in the city is this massive influx of data centers that are just using so much electricity that they're putting a lot of heat into the environment. And so we were naturally curious, how does that affect the heat equation in Phoenix? And and what can we do about it, really, is what we care about.
Yeah, and there's different sizes of these data centers, and you looked at different sizes, but how do you go about taking, okay, you didn't, I remember in the past few years, we've seen folks from ASU dragging that thing along the street, all the meteorological stuff. You weren't dragging anything along the street, were you? This is a little more high tech than that. Oh, here we go. You had vehicles, huh?
Yeah, so what we've done is we've created these measurement, instrument platforms that we mount on vehicles. We typically try to go for electric vehicles so that we're not worried about the heat exhaust from the vehicle itself. And in this picture that you're showing now, you see on both the passenger and driver side window, we have these shielded air temperature sensors. They're extremely fast response and highly accurate, what are called RTD sensors that measure air temperature every 2 seconds as we drive across a neighborhood. Simultaneously mounted on the top of this car, we've got a 2D sonic anemometer. So when we start and finish our traverses, and even while we're driving, we can discern the actual local wind speed and direction. Oh. And wind direction is particularly important in our study because we're really interested in, can we see a thermal signature of the data centers? And that signature is obviously going to be downwind of the data center.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so this thermometer setup, I just want to make sure folks understand, it's not like the little thermometer thing I got in my car that I don't even know where that sensor is. This is high-tech stuff.
Exactly, yeah. So these are very, very fast response and highly accurate sensors, much better than putting something underneath your hood, which is, of course, affected by your engine heat as well. These are exposed directly to the air as the car drives. So it's what we call an aspirated sensor, but instead of being aspirated by a fan, it's actually aspirated by the motion of the vehicle. So as long as we're going 5, 10 miles an hour or faster, we're getting a good wind flow across that sensor, and we're getting a good representation of what the local air temperature is.
So do you get volunteers? Are they students that drive these areas? And I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, because I was already wrong off the top without my glasses, that you already have a set pattern that you want each of these vehicles to drive at certain parts of the day to sort of make your data apples and apples?
As much as possible, but so we've done these kinds of traverse measurements literally for decades in different cities, literally around the world. And what we typically do is we do multiple vehicles at the same time. As you see in this animation, the vehicles start and stop at the same location, so they're driving next to each other for a period of time, so we can cross-calibrate. Even though the sensors have been calibrated in the lab, we just make sure that they're matching up in terms of what they're measuring as they're driving. We typically will do at least 2 vehicles at a time. Sometimes we'll do 3, 4, or more. During this past summer and the summer before that, we actually worked with K-12 school teachers, and we didn't have them volunteer. We actually paid them for their effort in being part of a measurement campaign where we mounted these sensors on. We have a total of 24 sets of these sensors, so we can run up to about 20 plus cars at a time across the city. In this instance, we just used 2 electric cars to focus just on the data center and the neighborhoods around the data center.
And I think you might have just said it there. You did do it at different times during the day, and you did some nighttime readings as well.
Yeah. So far we've looked at just around sunrise, 5:30, 5-ish in the morning, up to about 5 in the evening. We have not done we have done overnight traverses in other parts of the city for different purposes. But for the data center studies, we've only been focusing on daytime measurements so far.
Okay.
And we do see very, very significant differences depending upon the actual time that we run our measurements. The magnitude of the wind and the recent wind directions are all very important determinants of where we see that signal.
So as we get into this, you can research and find out that there's already, and again, we don't know sizes, but there's already somewhere around 100 data centers operating in Arizona, and maybe another 90 to 100 that are quote unquote planned. Again, we don't know the size of those yet. But are we essentially, we know about the urban heat dome, how hot Phoenix has gotten over the last 20 and 30 years, because of all the growth and whatnot. Are we going to be making little mini heat domes all around these data centers, wherever they are?
So that's exactly what we're seeing. As we drive around the data centers, we see, up to 300, 400, 500 yards downwind, we're seeing a thermal impact. And so, what's really interesting that we haven't gotten into yet is this notion that the heat that's coming off the rooftops of these data centers is tremendous, but much of it doesn't loft into the neighborhood. Much of it actually, it's buoyant air, so it rises into the atmosphere. And so you've got all these chimneys of heat rising from these data centers. So in addition to what happens to mix very locally downwind, there's a lot of heat that's going vertically into the atmosphere above the city. And as we've seen from prior studies, just looking at cities more generally and what's known as anthropogenic waste heat emissions from cities tend to have an effect on local weather. They tend to create these effects where you have a larger downwind precipitation pattern than upwind or over the city. And so just imagine, if we double the energy consumption and the heat release in the city due to the influx of new data centers, we might expect to have not just these local effects in literally hundreds of locations around the city, but possibly larger scale effects.
Yeah, and there are large scale effects because as I was reading and doing a little bit of studying, I put my glasses back on to get the numbers right there, my friend. Some of these bigger data centers that are planned for Arizona will actually be using the amount of power that I say a neighborhood or a town of 180,000 people would use. So I talk about mini plumes. That's not really a mini plume. That's a pretty big heat signature headed up into the atmosphere.
Right. No, it is absolutely. And what's unique about the data centers is, so a single data center might emit as much heat as what comes off the air conditioners from, like you say, 100 or 200,000 homes.
Right.
But it's all concentrated by about a factor of 1,000 in terms of the area that it covers. It's much more condensed emission of that heat. And so very locally, we would expect the possibility of a much larger effect than what you simply have in and around neighborhoods.
This sounds like we might have to talk about microclimates, and I think we'll do that after we take a break. We're talking with David Saylor from over at ASU about data centers and how much heat they send out into the atmosphere and how that could impact us. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Sonoran Sky Live. We're talking about data centers and how much heat they put into the atmosphere and if that is going to be an impact on our neighborhoods. David Saylor is joining us. He's from the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, the director there. And David, I mentioned microclimates before, but only because it's a fancy word and I don't know really what it means. But before I ask about microclimates, I do want to ask you about, because I've read through your papers, it seems to me your position on, I want folks to understand, your position on data centers seems to be they're here, they're coming, we need to figure out how to best integrate them into a society, into a desert in Arizona where we've got a lot of heat to deal with. Would that be a fair way of saying that?
Yeah, that's accurate. We're really interested in actually working with the developers, designers, builders, and operators of data centers to design them in such a way and operate them in such a way that that heat signature has as small of an impact on its neighbors as possible.
So we are going to talk about neighborhoods and microclimates. Is there going to be an impact? And there's one of the data centers that's under construction. It's down in Ahwatukee, and it's not far from where people live. Is there going to be neighborhood impacts? Can we call these microclimates?
Yeah, sure. Definitely, in terms of the terminology, when we think of microclimates, we're really thinking, all the way down to sort of the individual, parcel of land and individual people that occupy it, up to perhaps the neighborhood scale. And so these are definitely neighborhood scale or microclimate scale effects that we're seeing from the data centers. And we started with the observational campaign, but ultimately the goal, like I said, is to find solutions. And in order to get to the solutions, what we're doing is we're developing a modeling infrastructure so we can actually model these data centers and the heat emissions from them, and then modify the model to see what strategies we can employ and how they impact that downwind plume.
How much heat is being emitted, and I know it varies, but how much heat is being emitted from at least the data centers that you looked at?
Yeah, so I mean, typically we've been looking at medium to large data centers, 30 megawatt range to 150 plus megawatts, and so this is above 100 sort of is the hyperscale, and so that magnitude of heat emissions, one way to look at it is to simply try to convert that into, well, what's the impact on air temperatures? And that's a very complicated question because the heat doesn't all stay within a certain volume that we can calculate. We have to actually measure the effect or model the effect. And what we're seeing typically is downwind warming on the order of 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes more, that we are attributing to the data centers because that heat signal changes direction with the winds. So it's always downwind of the data center.
So folks are going to say 1 to 4 degrees. What does that mean? Some folk, I remember 25, 30 years ago when we were talking about 1 degree Fahrenheit change in atmospheric temperatures, and that got no attention at all. So how do you get attention to this when it's a 1 to 4 degree change?
Right. And, when you step out of your house in the afternoon to go get your mail, and you take that long walk to your mailbox, and it's 110 degrees out, can you physically sense that, oh, actually it's 112 degrees, not 110? It's difficult to really to say that people will be able to hone in on it and feel that difference at a personal level. But in reality, every degree is associated with an increased amount of energy consumption for air conditioning across the city, for water use across the city, and for risk of adverse health outcomes. And so, sorry, my lights just went off.
That's okay. We can see you all right.
All right. So, if you just think about 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase in air temperatures, if that were happening across the entirety of the city of Phoenix, that would correspond to tens of millions of dollars a year in additional air conditioning costs. That's one way to think about it.
So like around one of these data centers where there could be a few degree difference depending on the time of day and the wind direction, you might go and turn your air conditioner up just to keep your house at a level that you're comfortable with.
Or your air conditioner might simply be running longer.
I got it. So that's where some of the extra energy use can come in. And that's why, a couple of degrees means something, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
All right, so let's talk about why these data centers give off heat. And I'm going to give you my little generic thing. First of all, they're data centers, so all that stuff's got to be cooled, just like your house, let's say. And once it's cooled, that hotter air has got to go somewhere. And so my sort of, here's how I relate it to. In my backyard, there's a big old air conditioner pumping away. And when it turns on in the summer, it's hotter above that plume of fan that's taking that hot air and shooting up in the sky than it is 10 feet over there. Is that the same kind of concept with data centers, that there's got to be heat coming out of them and it's got to go somewhere?
Yeah, so it's what we would simply refer to as conservation of energy, right? You're using electricity to power all these server blades, literally thousands or 100,000 plus server blades, all that heat. And there are many different ways that these data centers deal with that heat in terms of the local cooling for the data center floor. But ultimately that heat has to leave the building, right? And so in some instances, especially in older data centers, there's a use of evaporative cooling, so cooling towers, if you will, which take that heat and reject it by essentially evaporating water. And so you get a lot of water vapor emissions and not as much sensible heat emissions. But in the desert, where we're so concerned about the availability of water, we are increasingly going towards pure air-based cooling systems, or in some cases, what are known as hybrid systems that might include a little bit of evaporative cooling, especially during the hottest times of the year when conventional air conditioning equipment, air-based systems are not very efficient as the outside ambient air temperature increases, and the air temperature where these air conditioning systems are operating on the rooftop, those rooftop areas can easily reach 130 or 140 degrees Fahrenheit when it's 110 or 115 out. And so very locally, we have very hot environments for the equipment to operate in, which means it's not going to operate as efficiently. And so they put a lot of heat into the air shed. And I think there was a project that's ongoing now down in Tucson. I think it's called Project Blue, where they were initially going to use evaporative cooling, but there was so much pushback about where they're going to get the water and what the impacts would be, that they have now switched to a plan of using purely air-based cooling systems. And as a result, all of that heat comes off in the form of warm or hot air.
Is the air-based more efficient, less efficient than trying to do an evaporative cooler situation, or do we know?
It's much more just a matter of whether you're using a lot of electricity and putting the waste heat into the air as, in the form of sensible heat, or whether you're using a mix of a little bit of electricity and a lot of water, and taking the heat out that way. So, it's not apples, and apples in terms of the comparison of water versus electricity. But certainly the calculus here in the desert has been, we need to focus on air-based cooling systems.
Okay.
And that's where my research then comes in, because I'm interested in the sensible heat load on the neighborhoods.
And that's what we're going to be talking about next, where your research hopefully will be taking us. We're talking with David Saylor at ASU. We're talking about the heat that comes off of data centers, and we will be right back. This is Sonoran Sky Live. We're talking about the heat off of data centers. There's 100 new ones about being planned for Arizona, so it's going to have some sort of impact. We're talking with David Saylor. And David, before we ask you the questions, I just want to refer folks to a great article, ASU News, a reporter named Joe Rojas Burke wrote in the middle of May. You can check that article, search it. It's a really good article and kind of breaks down what we've been talking about. But you do research so you can figure out solutions. Where do you hope that your research is going to take you and in helping this potential problem that we have with data centers and heat?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd start by saying it's not just about data centers. There are a lot of what we call large load electric customers all around the Phoenix metro area, everything from data centers to semiconductor fabs and so forth. And so where I'm hoping to take this research is really to look at different solutions, different strategies that can help reduce the downwind warming effect. And that involves looking at different design and operational characteristics for the data center facility itself, as well as the HVAC equipment and how it's operated. But then also to look at the land that the data center or large load customer is on and explore solutions like whether we can include green and blue infrastructure to help provide localized cooling to offset some of that warming effect. Or perhaps we look at facility setbacks to make sure that distance between the facility and the neighborhood is large enough to really diffuse that heating effect.
And do you think going forward that the impact is going to mostly be the heat and neighborhood and people who might work around these facilities? And you don't see this as a quote unquote big climate changer or anything like that, do you?
It's a climate changer in as much as, as we increase our energy consumption, we have to pay attention to where that energy is sourced and whether we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere. And so if we're essentially doubling the electric load of the city of Phoenix, that does have global consequences in terms of the carbon emissions, depending upon the source of the electricity.
So here's my rookie question. I like to ask a rookie question every time I do one of these because I don't know that much. But could digging a big hole way down in the earth, hundreds and hundreds of feet, where you can tap into a rather benign cooler temperature, could that? I know the expenses would be gazillions of dollars, but is that something that anyone's even looked at?
So geothermal in general is a very, very effective technology in certain locations in terms of extracting heat.
Right.
From the ground, or in some cases storing it. But as you suggest, it's likely a very costly solution. And ultimately, as you put the heat in, it doesn't just go away. It's just being stored. And so it could have long-term ramifications in terms of really running out of storage capacity before it starts affecting things like the groundwater supply or other things.
As you say, the heat's got to leave the building, so Royal, stop with your crazy ideas. So as the heat leaves the building, is there any way that maybe we can figure out a way to use that heat some way, where at least it's being utilized?
Absolutely. That's actually a very sharp observation, which is especially in colder climates where we have these large load customers, they're putting off so much heat. Now it's what we call low grade heat, so it's not very useful for many purposes, but it can be used for industrial processes, or can be used if you have a district heating system in your city or in your neighborhood, where you can actually use that heat and provide it to the local homes or local businesses. In Phoenix, we don't really have much of a need for district heating, and so that's not a great solution. But maybe, co-locating facilities. A lot of industrial facilities require low-grade heat. Rather than them generating it themselves, perhaps they can just borrow it from the waste heat that's coming off of a data center or other large load customer.
Yeah, one person's waste may be another person's gold mine, and we've said that in so many subjects. David Saylor, he's from the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning. He's the director. There's a great study on these data centers and how much heat they may impact. David, I appreciate you taking the time, and just want to thank you and all your colleagues for doing this research, because I think it makes all of us a little bit smarter.
All right, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, have a great day, and we'll talk to you folks later on Sonoran Sky Live.